and welcome to today's Science Talk. I am delighted to welcome you to today's talk, Reframing Carbon Offset Policies from Exclusionary Satellite-Based Governance for Sustainable Use that Respects Indigenous Rights. My name is Dr. Miriam Axel, and I am thrilled to be your host today. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, we're delighted to have you here, and we'd like to remind you that all of our 2025 science talks, as well as the entire 2024 series hosted by Professor Grace Oluwasanya, are available both on our website at unu.edu/science-talks with an S at the end, as well as on our YouTube channel. And you can even catch last week's science talk, and today's will be posted shortly. Also like to remind you that we will conclude with a interactive question and answer session after the talk. So please use the chat, the Q&A box to put your questions in, and I will be sure to read them out to our speaker. And now I'm delighted to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Ju Lee, who specializes in eco-hydrology and remote sensing. Her research focuses on monitoring forest temperature and soil moisture using passive and active microwave satellites, contributing to wildfire and hydrological risk management to advise policy. At UNU-INWEH, she is developing analytical methods to assess the impact of heat waves generated by mega forest fires. In addition, she is developing new UNU-INWEH courses on the use of remote sensing for detecting and predicting wildfire spread. And she is the team lead for the forest module on the Sustainability Nexus aid, which I think she'll discuss after the talk. Dr. Lee holds a PhD in spatial hydrology and land surface satellite data assimilation from Politecnico di Milano. She has contributed to major global research initiatives, including WMO's Global Energy and Water Exchanges, African Monsoon Multidisciplinary Analyses, the Asian Monsoon Experiment for GAME Tibet, and the FAO Water Energy Food Nexus Report and the Northern Water Futures Project focused in Canada and Siberia of the Global Water Futures Program in Canada. She's previously served as a research professor at Korea University and the Seoul National University in South Korea. And now, without further ado, it is my great honor and pleasure to turn it over to you, Ju. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for a perfect introduction about me. So, do you want me to share the screen now?
Yes.
If you're ready? Okay, great. Can you see the screen?
Yes, and it's in presenter mode.
Okay, great. Okay, great. Let me start. Okay, today, my name is Ju-hyung Lee, and today I'm going to present perspectives slightly different from traditional carbon policies. Traditionally, carbon strategies have focused heavily on conservation, like preserving forests and limiting human activities. Although this approach has had some success, they overlook a recent and upcoming ecological destructions arising from heat waves and warming and drought and so on, and even indigenous issues. So today I'm going to discuss how to open up a new pathway for climate actions that are both equitable and effective in carbon mitigation. So before going into there, let me briefly summarize the core achievement of COP29. And actually, both COP29 and various carbon players are all focusing on nature-based solutions. So I'm going to briefly summarize about that and definition of NBS. And under these conditions, I expect to have some these conditions may make some potential issues that may arise as a result of the decisions to be made at COP29. For example, such as ecological disruptions caused by warming and heat waves and and drought and so on. So I will briefly introduce those issues and what we can do about it. And I will wrap up of this seminar by making some policy suggestions that transition from conservation to sustainable use, which will integrate satellite observations and views indigenous issues from that perspective of sustainable use, um, so that we can successfully implement the global carbon policies in line with UNFCCC. At COP29, clearer rules for international carbon trading were established to trade internationally transferred mitigation outcome and to achieve their nationally determined contributions. And plus oversight mechanism, UN supervised, centralized mechanism to ensure environmental integrity and transparency for carbon emission reductions. However, as compared to funding resources and financial, market issues and so on, relatively, there were few discussions on ecological disruptions and indigenous issues. So today I would like to discuss about that by examining scientific limitations for current oversight mechanisms. I would like to revisit indigenous peoples through the lenses of ecological justice. I will provide perspectives that shift from conservation to sustainable use, so that this can be included to the carbon policies, applying the exactly same standards that apply to us. So at COP29, obviously, nature-based solutions, the portion of nature-based pollution is already very high in current policies, but because of the decisions made at COP29, the NBS accounts for a significant portion, and these are expected to be a bit more active because of COP29. When I say the portion is high, this is compared to engineering-based solutions like carbon capture storage or renewable energy, that sort of things. However, if the NVS is promoted through carbon offset programs, then it is highly likely that indigenous people's lands are designated as protected area, and then indigenous people can't really conduct small-scale agricultural activity any longer, and their livestock farming are not allowed, and so on. So this is where some conflict may rise. In addition to COP29, there are various carbon players, but they are all focusing on NBS. Then what is NBS? It's to use nature to make some benefits, various kinds of benefits like climate mitigation, adaptations in terms of forest soil wetness and water security, community well-being, and so on. And all these are pretty much mainly based on reforestation, afforestation, soil conservation, protection sort of things. So it's like really something like just don't touch here, some sort of like that, rather than sustainable use. So I'm just briefly introduce what it looks like. The current global standard looks like for the International Union for Conservation of Nature actually set up a global standard to be applied for the NBS, and these 8 things are something that they suggested. This is really beautifully designed, scientifically grounded, so much makes sense. However, it's actually extremely difficult and challenging to implement it on the ground scientifically. So if NBS is promoted as carbon offset, there are several issues to pop up. And a carbon offset is a system that allows individuals and organizations to compensate for their greenhouse gas emissions by investing in projects that reduce or remove the equivalent amount of carbon dioxide. It could be in, some other countries but usually in developing countries. So this kind of carbon credits can be generated by renewable energy efficiency. NBS is the major one of the major ones, and methane capture and so on. And this kind of carbon credit and carbon offset trading can be done by voluntary carbon markets. However, if promoting voluntary carbon markets or international carbon markets, this could lead to various issues inadvertently. There are two main issues. The one pillar is scientific limitation. The other one is indigenous issues. Scientifically, there is some limitations for evaluating and validating large-scale carbon accounting, so that there may be overestimation or overlook complexity in estimating carbon storage in warming, drying environment, so that market this kind of profit-driven offset may not really have any ecological effectiveness. And if overemphasizing on market-centered approach, this also may marginalize indigenous rights. So if we look at it one by one, actually current carbon regime, even like Vera, like something like carbon credit verifiers and even oversight bodies, or even widely used carbon model, they don't really much reflect ecological dysfunctions or disruptions caused by warming, drought, and heat waves. So the biggest premise of nature-based solution is actually considering vegetation as carbon sink, but this is actually not really certain any longer. There is a huge transition from carbon sink to emitter. There are so many papers are coming about talking about these issues, and we to be discussed at a science community level. Or just this is a recent 5 years monitoring. In 2023, Canadian wildfires actually produced 22 or 25% of global carbon from wildfires. This is almost 5 times average for the past 20 years. And this is far exceeds the emissions allowed for Canada economy and triple an annual climate pollution from burning fossil fuels in Canada. And actually, we're going to see the graph very soon on the next page, but this is far exists any other, fossil fuel emissions in any other countries except major countries. In Siberian taiga forests, they are also moving from carbon sinks to carbon source. They almost large scale wildfires occur almost every year, like 2019, 2020, 2023, 2024, almost every year. And Amazon also experienced high carbon emissions because of wildfires in recent 5 years. And Australia is the another country who is burning lots of carbon in 2023 and 2020 and so on. So I just cited a paper named Global Carbon Budget. If you look at in here, wildfire natural carbon emissions from wildfires in Canada in 2023 actually exceeding any other countries in the world except just two biggest carbon emitter countries, China and USA. So this is actually very important to note. And another thing is that this kind of wildfire is very much pronounced in boreal wildfires, and I will discuss why boreal fires is as particularly vulnerable to wildfires in the end of this presentation again. But anyway, the boreal forests and the wildfires is their trend is increasing. And severe, this kind of severe wildfires are very related to unusually warm conditions with low soil moisture. So actually, when it comes to the capability of carbon sequestrations, there's very mixed signal findings. Like for like sometimes like some study report that trees grows better in elevated carbon dioxide or warming conditions and so on. But critically, one of the actually just most important factor in assessing the capability of carbon sequestration ability is actually soil moisture. In low soil moisture, terrestrial carbon uptake is significantly reduced and no photosynthesis can be done effectively. And rather and plus that also decrease fuel moisture, so increasing fuel availability, so that actually increase fire risk in low soil moisture, and there's a crop failure because of drought. So this figure actually speaking the same thing. When the soil moisture content decrease, carbon uptake is significantly decreased. Photosynthetic activity rates are so much decreasing. Next slide. Yeah, similar study. Yeah, a similar story from various kinds of sources. So, like when soil moisture decrease, photosynthesis also decrease, and transpiration also decrease, and stomata conductivity also decrease, and so on. Yep, a similar story from different sources. So this graph also shows that net land carbon uptake is pretty much dependent on soil moisture. So like drought and low soil moisture, warming and so on is actually there's a huge impact on the carbon sequestration ability of forests and agriculture vegetation. If you look at on this right hand side, when the soil moisture drought and atmospheric feedback is very, I mean, not really going fine, and not soil moisture is very low, then uh, there's a negative impact on plant carbon uptake. So these countries in red actually very much highly likely that they would have high risk of wildfires, plus much decreased ability of carbon sequestration. So although they conserve their forests, although they just block any access to their protected areas and so on, those areas are highly likely to be developed into wildfires instead of carbon sequestrations. And this is very important ecological disruption. Yep, so like I explained, when the soil moisture and vegetation moisture decrease, fire spread is increase. So these are highly related to the hydrological and thermal development of forest. Unfortunately, the Vera is actually one of the widely used carbon credit certifiers. So when the carbon market is activated, they have to get approved and certified by these organizations. They provide kind of standard, yeah, to evaluate carbon amount. However, unfortunately, they don't monitor this kind of change and effectors. If you look at this table and just briefly summarize it, even for the fire, they look at the past data and something in the history data. They look at some climate variables, precipitation, and some temperature and so on, and land use, and some deforestation risk and NDVI and so on. However, these are not the direct indicator for the thermal and hydrological condition of the forest or agricultural lands. Um, so why near real-time vegetation fuel conditions or like vegetation conditions are not properly provided because that's very complicated. Before this warming, we actually assume pre-warming conditions, meaning that we just equate air temperature to some other like land surface temperature. And so we actually never really deeply looked at this kind of warming conditions where the canopy temperature is largely different from air temperature and so on. And instead, we heavily relied on like vegetation index, sort of that sort of chlorophyll contents and so on. But these are not really effective to detect thermal and hydrological evolutions of forests. And I wouldn't go in depth about this is too much like scientific issues and so. But anyway, the bottom of it is that in both remote sensing and satellite, and even in the modeling, we've never actually closely sophisticatedly deal with those warming conditions. So we just carried out simplifications or or just use it empirical equations or something like a linear approximations to detect those changes in forests. So uh, accordingly, as a result, these vectors are not included in carbon verifying certifiers. The another issue is the locality of carbon modeling that carbon credit certifiers use. As actually, we've actually visited these slides already. I just try to show the global currently widely used global standard for NBS is one of the item was actually design at scale. This is very important for NBS because NBS is actually efficiency is very low. So we try to carry out and conduct and implement this MBS or carbon offset project over vast areas so that we can increase amount of carbon to be sequestered. So we should be designed, so NBS and carbon offset project should be designed at a scale large enough to sequester a lot of carbon. However, this is actually scientifically tricky. Before going there, let me just outline the concepts of carbon offset. NVS can be promoted, implemented through the carbon offset project, and carbon offset is a system. Yeah. Looked at this outline. But anyway, the thing is that the important thing for the success of NBS, the project should be designed at a large scale. However, however, the most of the carbon model used by verified carbon standard, for example, BERA, is very local. They use local sampling to validate it. So local sampling means they install. Just let me pick pen. They install point sampling somewhere here. Some at a point scale, yeah. Several sampling somewhere here. However, when they change their point locations somewhere here and here and here, then the spatial average is quite different from another local sampling. So when you change the location of sampling, then they can produce a totally different spatial average outcome from the other mapping. So this kind of point scale soil sampling has really unlikely to acquire spatial representation and does not really reflect a soil heterogeneity and the landscape scale or the vest scale required for the success of NVS. This kind of things is not really resolved by science yet. And another issue is that there is linear approximation and linear regression of carbon models used by verified carbon standard program. So the empirical approach linearity are site specific. So which means that if the model is satisfied, for example, this area here, this model doesn't necessarily applicable to here, which is quite different from here. So that is land surface heterogeneity. So it's scientist specific, so really unlikely to be effective when we apply this model to vast areas in other countries, like several countries, and even in one single countries. The another factor is that, as we discussed so far, there's overestimation of our carbon sequestration ability. In low soil moisture, drought conditions, unprecedentedly large scale wildfire carbon emissions, these kind of things is actually neglected in evaluating carbon credits right now. Yeah, so just just briefly summarize again. So like locality means that if you change the location of soil sampling, and they can present totally different spatial averages from other sampling. So conservation policy is not really cure-all. It does not really guarantee carbon mitigations. And in science community, we discuss various things, and I will just outline just a few things out of many. Just one thing is that soil sequestrations. Afforestation increase soil organic carbon density in carbon poor soils, but that decrease soil carbon in carbon rich soils. So meaning that although we conduct afforestations or reforestations, the responses is really unpredictable. We just don't know how much soil will be sequestered by layer. Maybe it sequesters in top layer, but maybe not in the deeper layer, and so on. And as we briefly discussed, in dry regions, low soil moisture is highly vulnerable to wildfires and reduces photosynthetic efficiency. And in case of Brazil, they reduced deforestation, but interestingly, because of wildfire, their carbon emission increased. And according to several studies, there's a report that 90% of rainforest carbon offset is actually does not show any effect at all. And there are more and more study that indigenous peoples grazing and agriculture activities actually helpful for carbon mitigation if they conducted properly, like for example, like rotational grazing and so on. So conservation is not really cure all, and really poorly planned conservation actually can increase carbon emissions. And second issue for the carbon market is about indigenous people. Like Red Plus Plus is actually the best example for indigenous issues. It's highly likely to have such an issue again. If the indigenous lands are designated as conservation areas, then they completely restrict any access to their homelands, and there's eviction and displace indigenous peoples from their land. So this is actually main issues. And more specifically, there may be land grabbing, like external carbon projects may target indigenous land, then they ask indigenous people to relocate and never allow them to enter their home country, their homelands, and limit their access to the forests and traditional land use. And there may be a lack of participation by indigenous people. This FRIG is very important value in the United Nations. This FRIG is very important value, which is clearly indicated by UN Declaration on Indigenous Rights. It's very important in international law and environmental law and human rights. And there may be also already, yeah, there is already unfair benefit distribution. When there's compensation, a very little portion is given to indigenous people. And carbon reductions may be overestimated, overstated, misreported when damage or human rights violation occur, and compensation accountability is very weak. There may be social conflict, and there may be ecological cultural damage. This is actually already happened. But the thing is that this is all because of the belief that conservation must be upheld and deforestation agriculture activities should be thoroughly eradicated. And this is very serious. Whenever I'm looking at UN reports and even UNDP and so on, there is very clear belief that deforestation is just bad things to get rid of. However, our science does not really have clear and unanimous consensus about that perspectives, so that we must be very careful and cautious in determining how to treat indigenous peoples. We often see a significant atrocities going on in the ground. When the policies are implemented on the ground, many aspects of science can be simplified, and complexities in science and modern nature can be overlooked, and these may lead to violence. So, uh, so not only just for indigenous equity, but also for ecological disruptions and reduce the capacity of carbon sequestrations, there's a need to shift. Like we just discussed it earlier, and carbon sequestration may not be really effective as much as we can under drought and low soil moisture conditions. So drought and low soil moisture conditions and forest warming, does not really support conservation policy any longer. We have to actively establish sustainable management systems. So in such a drought conditions like logging, removing fallen tree leaves, or even uprooting trees to prevent wildfires is actually more important and needed than the conservations. So that this actually should integrate timber business and integrate industry and daily farmings and agricultural businesses. Unfortunately, the current portion of sustainable use, such as sustainable use in our current NBS, is is amazingly very low. Um, That's partially because that's more complicated than conservation. Conservation sounds, simple. People think that, easily think that, oh, it's eco-friendly, very cheap, very easy. We just protect the land, that's it. However, like sustainable use, very complicated. We exactly know when and where we should cut the trees. Harvesting timing, irrigation timing, we need so much information. However, unfortunately, there's a lack of data regarding whether forests or agricultural lands act as carbon sequesters or emitters at the moment. So for the carbon policy to succeed, we must respond in a way that appropriate, keep the face together with the ecological state, and poorly planned carbon offset schemes or conservation policies like appropriate planting or harvesting, yeah, can add more carbon because just accumulating more fuels in forests and cause large scale wildfires. So decisions on whether to plant or protect or harvest actually should be based on the nature rather than human theory, a priori knowledge, or historical data. So to do so, we need real-time satellite observations because quite often the simulations, like model simulations based upon pre-warming conditions, like we briefly discussed it earlier. Like, for example, air temperature is equal to canopy temperature. This is totally wrong, inapplicable to warming conditions. And there's no heat transfer capacity and so on the surface. I mean, in the model, we make a lot of pre-warming conditions that worked fine so far, but in recent 5 heat wave conditions, and when we have unprecedentedly large-scale wildfires, such a assumption is not valid any longer. So we have to measure real-time satellite observations much more uh, responsive to our change. So under so incorporate such a perspectives. I mean, by conservation policy, any kinds of deforestation and grazing activities is something that totally, completely eradicate or ban is like considered like a spreading germs or something. But under heat wave conditions and under sustainable use, from the perspective of sustainable use, the indigenous people's activities like agriculture activities and so on is not something to penalize. Actually, that's something that government can provide tax exemptions or incentives and so on to promote their activities. The thing is that we have to train them how to make their activities to be ecologically beneficial. Like we can inform like when, like harvesting times, irrigation times, and which tree should be harvested and so on. So this kind of things is called like precision forestry, like selective logging, and precision agriculture. Like right now, we actually overuse the water and fertilizer and wasting money and contaminating the nature environment too much. However, these kind of things can be resolved by precision agriculture and precision forestry, and this will lead to sustainable use. However, this kind of implementation would require a lot of scientific data and information, which actually not really available at the moment, but we can go towards that direction. So we briefly summarize and introduce this kind of concept and perspective through our policy brief, and we also are updating our activities and perspectives and introducing our methodologies to detect thermal and hydrological conditions in forests and so on to our forest module. So you are welcome to visit our module, and please raise your suggestions, and happy to invite you. So before I wrap up my seminar, I just briefly would like to introduce what kind of efforts we're making towards this kind of directions later, like satellite-based governance and ecological status will tell us whether which trees and when we should harvest and even plant. And the point is that if you look at the red dots and black cross indicates land surface temperature, which is currently freely provided by weather agency like UNU-INWEH, and the red circle is actually canopy temperature that I newly retrieved from the new satellites. So canopy temperature is not available at operational system or federal government at all. However, I found that if closely monitoring canopy temperature, then we are able to predict whether we will have wildfire or not from this specific forest, even before the fire occur. So, however, this kind of prediction, it could not be accurately made using existing land surface temperature provided by widely used weather agencies. And um, And this kind of a pre-warming assumptions widely used by model is also largely unrecognized. So and the plus, the right-hand side is Siberian wildfires and left-hand side is Canadian wildfires. These are two reasons that we have, I mean, that shows the most large wildfires in the world. They are all in boreal forests. And however, although there is forest warming at this kind of scale, like million hectare uh, large scale, actually monitoring is not really conducted very well. So although there's high risk in wildfires, it's not really, no one really observe it at the moment. And the other aspect is that in case of major wildfires in countries like Australia or Russia, we often see that arsonists are being persecuted. However, contrary to what is commonly believed, science actually showed that under warming conditions and heat waves, unprecedentedly large-scale wildfire spread is actually not because of ignition by arsonists. Yeah, although like if I mean, although an arsonist set a fire, if the forest is wet, then that does not really spread wildfires that much. So very important to monitor what's going on in our forests at large scale. However, government does not observe this yet. So wildfire is pretty much self-sustaining, and they actually self-spread their wildfires very much. So without proper monitoring to track whether vast areas in forests are developed into carbon sink or carbon emitter, like through wildfires, carbon management efforts that we are undertaking are actually may lead us to more risk unexpected. The other thing is that, like we discussed, boreal forest is actually present the largest wildfires, and one of the reason is because the combination of snow melt and forest warming actually makes optimal conditions to spread and produce large-scale wildfires. So these graphs just pretty much show that as long as we are able to monitor forest warming through like canopy temperature, for example, the new variable that I retrieved from new satellites, then we are able to predict snow melt. And then after that, a forest fire as well. So this graph pretty much show that there's a snow melt with increasing forest warming and increased canopy temperatures. So this is another story. Today we discuss about soil moisture, how much soil moisture is important for assessment of carbon sequestrability. And unfortunately, soil moisture product is available in the website. We can easily get it through the download. However, there is overestimation, some bias over the vegetated lands. That's exactly where we need to actually closely look at because of carbon sequestrations. However, for that vegetated lands, there's high bias and errors. So depending on how you manage your satellite systems, that may produce large errors and uncertainty. So this graph just basically showing that in figure A and figure C, over the same reasons, over the same variables of soil moisture, there's actually large difference in their estimations. So like reliable estimation and technology is really important to successfully implement our carbon mitigation strategies. So just a wrap up. Yep. So global standard for carbon credit accounting is very important for legitimacy. However, scale issues, locality of carbon models and that they use still remain. And MBS and verified carbon standards should incorporate ecological disruptions that we recently experienced, like heat waves and fires and so on, and ensure peaceful coexistence with indigenous peoples. And displacement eviction of these indigenous people is not really scientifically based, and UN should be able to investigate, intervene with their such a mistreatment. And from the perspectives of sustainable use, indigenous activities like agricultural activities and grazing and harvesting is not really bad thing to get rid of. It's actually we have to train them, we have to help them to be aligned with ecological disruptions. For an alternative, satellite-based governance can be suggested to promote sustainable use and provide more information for which trees should be cut, when we should cut, irrigation timing, harvesting timing, which trees and which agricultural land should be harvested, and so on. And again, we should bridge science, policy, indigenous issues together. There's a huge gap between policymaker and science. So, for example, policymakers sometimes you just say that, okay, I will give you this funding so that you can use your technology and solve the problem. However, it's really extremely difficult to be accepted by the federal government, although the technology is available. There's people are sometimes very conservative, and it's totally different story to be it's accepted by operational centers and federal government, and even even in scientific communities. So this kind of conversation is very needed. Actually, in scientific community, the issues that we discussed today is sort of widely spread already. There's awareness about the limitations of this carbon accounting. However, if looking at the COP29, this kind of major issues is actually not really fully discussed. So such a bridge is more important. And yeah, and the shift from carbon offset or NBS to actual emission is very important, cannot be overemphasized enough. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much for a fantastic presentation, and thank you so much for all of your excellent work. I encourage our listeners to check out the next AID forest modules that you shared, as well as your recent policy brief. Just to start us off, it seems like it's clearly very complex modeling these issues, and you talked a lot about sort of the remote sensing constraints and the fact that we really don't have real-time data on the vegetation fuel condition. And I'm just wondering, from your perspective, first of all, how critical is real-time monitoring to understand these dynamics? And have you seen any other advances in remote sensing, or in the types of monitoring, say indigenous or local monitoring networks? Are there any sort of success stories that you've seen? And how can we help deal with this problem of limited remote sensing constraints?
First, it's very extremely urgently needed. I mean, such a like thermal hydrological conditions in forests is actually, I think, one of the most urgent need that we have to actually share at the global level, because I mean, not only like some major countries, wildfire countries like Canada or Siberia, they need this kind of informations to integrate timber business. I mean, they can use timber business to harvest and get rid of fewer accumulations before the fire occur. But government does not really actually try to utilize or embrace this kind of information, which is actually technically available, but system is not available at all. So it cannot be more over emphasized. It's very important, but kind of not really widely accepted by the federal government and or disaster prevention management at all. And secondly, most of our infrastructure is very local, and most of academia and resources very local. So what they do is that they set up a local station and measure meteorological variables like air temperature or like precipitation and so on, and try to predict the wildfires that occur like million hectare scale. So our perspectives pretty much local, stay local. But if you ask any successful story, um, I don't know. Just the cases that I discussed today was about the failure of carbon policy. Like for example, like Brazil, they completely eradicate deforestations, reduce deforestations, but they increased carbon emission after all because of wildfire. So they fail in wildfire management, and after all, the net carbon emission increase. And even Chile and some in like South America, several countries in South America is actually exposed to this kind of carbon market, carbon trading things, but their carbon management is not really successful. So if you ask about successful story, um, I don't know because satellite is not really widely accepted by government natural disaster prevention system yet. That's partially understandable, but yeah, previously there was uncertainty and inaccuracy issue in remote sensing. However, recently, we are developing retrieval algorithms. It's not really based upon empirical model any longer. We develop, yeah, several new retrieval algorithms. So there's a potential and there's a need to consider this kind of track very actively, but they don't they don't use this quite actively, positively.
Thank
And
you.
for the indigenous people, sorry, I just forgot your question for the indigenous people. Would you repeat again? I'm so sorry about that. For
Oh, no,
the
no, yeah.
for the last one, the third one for the indigenous people.
Yeah, I was wondering if you had come across any examples of local monitoring networks. I mean, you said that a lot of monitoring in this data is local. So I was wondering if there were any examples of Indigenous communities or Indigenous monitoring.
All right. Just my experience is pretty much about like Africa or not or South Africa, and unfortunately, they don't get any benefit out of this kind of satellite information at all. They are birds of anger and um, mm, mm. Yeah, so I think the best way to help them, the indigenous people in like South America and Africa, is to spread and actively embrace this kind of perspective of sustainable use. So indigenous activity is not really harmful for carbon mitigations and should embrace them under the frame of sustainable use. So yeah, I think that's something that I can do at this stage.
I think another related question on that is a lot of carbon offset projects still don't have the free, prior, and informed consent. Uh, uh,
Exactly. Yes, yes. Actually, I didn't really go into details about the all the misconduct in to be done in the field. Yeah, the atrocities and so on. It's very, I think that it's really serious problem, but the like scientists working in a desk and like, just dealing with computers, they don't really believe this story and they requested, I mean, they asked evidence. But while I'm investigating this issue, I found out that the problem is very serious. It's not really just eviction, displacement. The level of violence is much more serious, and they depress. They just um yeah. So I mean, there had been violence in that area because of like water, or I mean real resource and food and many things. But the thing is that that is being repeated by the name of carbon. So I think that's not something that science can support.
Do you have any recommendations for policymakers to both ensure, I mean, increase the level of genuine consent and consultation? And also, I mean, you mentioned the risk of violence. Is there a way that something like that could be taken into account in carbon offsetting mechanisms to sort of identify where that risk would be or prevent that type of issue?
Yeah, so I really think that whether the nature will sequester carbon or not. It's not something that I think human can decide. We really have to ask the mother nature. Is one way is actually look at the satellite observation. So when the satellite observation tells that, okay, this forest does not sequester any carbon, there is highly likely that this will be developed into wildfires, huge wildfires, then I think we should be willing to harvest and cut the trees. So in terms of from that perspectives, indigenous peoples are yeah, I think they are really exposed to significant injustice there with no any scientific evidence at all. So I highly recommend to I really highly recommend that policymakers should look at nature first, perhaps more than carbon market or funding resources. Actually, I think actually satellite information is for free. You don't need to, yeah, you don't need money. You don't need to, yeah, actually we can share the information through cell phone, whatever. So I'm really doubtful whether carbon mitigation is a matter of money or financial resources, because satellite data is free of charge, and you can access to anywhere. Of course, people should be educated. However, I think awareness is more important. I think the most fundamental value that we have to consider is that Mother Nature should coexist with human, and the most important thing in for successful uh, for the success of carbon policy, the most important thing is, I think, Mother Nature, how they change. We have to closely monitor them. We have to move together. We have to keep the face together with Mother Nature. I think that's something that policymakers may put more importance than maybe more than funding rating.
Thank you so much. I think that's a really excellent and important point to wrap up on. So again, want to thank you so much for your excellent work. Encourage our viewers to check out the Nexus Sustainability AID Forest module, as well as your recent policy brief, and we will share that as well. Thank you so much for your time and for sharing your expertise today. And we look forward to having you again soon.
Thank you very much for your this opportunity and arranging this meeting. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye bye.